Somewhere near the end of the New Testament is a short letter containing a detail that has fascinated biblical scholars for centuries. The letter is known as the Epistle of Jude. Within its opening section, Jude refers directly to Enoch, the seventh generation from Adam, and attributes a prophecy to him. The wording closely corresponds to a passage found in the ancient work now known as First Enoch. That creates an unusual textual situation. A book preserved separately from the New Testament is directly referenced inside one of its writings. The quotation itself is not a modern discovery. It has been visible in manuscripts and printed editions for centuries. But the larger historical question is much more interesting. If First Enoch was known to some Jewish and early Christian communities, if portions of it circulated widely during the Second Temple period, and if one New Testament writer explicitly attributed a prophecy to Enoch, why did the text eventually disappear from most biblical collections? Was its exclusion the result of a single decision? Was it gradually pushed aside? Or does the historical record reveal something more complicated? This documentary examines what can actually be established from the manuscripts, what ancient writers said about Enoch, and where the evidence stops being certain. Before we continue, subscribe if you enjoy documentary investigations into ancient manuscripts, forgotten texts, and unresolved questions in historical scholarship. The quote itself. The most important piece of evidence is found in Jude 14 through 15. The passage introduces Enoch as the seventh generation from Adam and attributes to him a prophecy concerning a future judgment involving the ungodly. The wording closely corresponds to First Enoch 1:9. The relationship between the two passages has been recognized by scholars for a very long time. This isn't simply a vague similarity involving a general idea such as judgment or divine punishment. The structure and vocabulary are sufficiently close that Jude's passage is widely understood as drawing directly from, or closely reflecting, the Enochic tradition preserved in First Enoch. That makes Jude particularly important for understanding how Enochic literature circulated in antiquity. But there is an important distinction. Jude's use of the passage tells us that the author knew and employed an Enochic tradition. It does not automatically establish the later canonical status of the entire Book of Enoch. That distinction becomes important when we examine what happened to the text in later centuries. Why did Enoch become controversial? The historical reception of First Enoch was never completely uniform. Different Jewish and Christian communities treated the text differently. Some appear to have regarded Enochic traditions as important sources of ancient religious thought. Others questioned the text's authority, or simply did not include it among the writings they considered authoritative. The early Christian writer Tertullian, writing around the beginning of the 3rd century, provides one of the clearest examples of someone defending Enoch's importance. In On the Apparel of Women, Tertullian discusses objections to First Enoch and points to the use of Enoch's prophecy in the Epistle of Jude as part of his argument. His reasoning was essentially that a text used by an early Christian writer should not be dismissed too easily. But Tertullian was not the only voice. Other influential writers expressed reservations about the work. Origen, for example, recognized the existence and influence of Enochic traditions, but treated the text's status with caution. Later writers, such as Jerome and Augustine, were considerably less favorable toward Enoch's authority. By the 4th and 5th centuries, First Enoch had largely disappeared from the mainstream biblical collections used throughout much of the Mediterranean world. But the disappearance was not universal. One tradition continued to preserve the complete work. That tradition was centered in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian manuscript tradition. The survival of First Enoch is closely connected with the Ethiopian manuscript tradition. The complete surviving form of the text is preserved in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopian Christian literature. For centuries, Ethiopian scribes continued copying and preserving Enochic material, while the text became increasingly difficult to access in Western Europe. This is one of the reasons the modern rediscovery of First Enoch is so closely associated with Ethiopia. In the 18th century, Scottish explorer James Bruce traveled through Ethiopia. In 1773, he brought 3 Ge'ez manuscripts of First Enoch back to Europe. Those manuscripts became extremely important for European scholarship. They demonstrated that the mysterious ancient work mentioned by earlier writers had survived in substantial form. For centuries, European scholars had known the name of Enoch and had encountered fragments or references to the work. But now they had access to complete Ethiopian manuscripts. The discovery transformed the study of Enochic literature. One of the manuscripts eventually became associated with the Bodleian Library at Oxford. This manuscript tradition remains central to modern translations and critical editions of First Enoch. The Dead Sea Scrolls changed the story. Then, in the 20th century, something happened that dramatically changed the historical picture. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Beginning in 1947, ancient manuscripts and fragments were discovered in caves around Qumran. Among them were multiple copies of Enochic writings. The fragments were written in Aramaic and date to the Second Temple period. The Qumran discoveries demonstrated something extremely important. First Enoch was not a medieval Ethiopian creation. It was an ancient work that circulated in Jewish communities centuries before the surviving Ethiopian manuscripts were copied. Among the Enochic fragments discovered at Qumran are manuscripts conventionally designated 4Q201 through 4Q212. Together, these fragments preserve substantial portions of several sections of First Enoch. They include material associated with the Book of the Watchers, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dream Visions, the Epistle of Enoch, and related Enochic traditions, including the Book of Giants. The evidence therefore confirms that Enochic literature circulated extensively during the Second Temple period. In fact, approximately 11 copies of Enochic material have been identified among the Qumran discoveries. That makes Enoch one of the most strongly represented ancient works in the collection. But there is something missing. And that absence created one of the most important debates in modern Enoch scholarship, the missing Book of Parables. The section known as the Book of Parables, or Similitudes of Enoch, covers chapters 37 through 71 of First Enoch. It contains some of the most unusual material in the entire Enochic collection. Among its central figures is a heavenly figure repeatedly described using the expression Son of Man. The figure is associated with judgment, authority, kingship, and the final transformation of the world. The terminology immediately attracted scholarly attention because similar language appears in later Jewish and Christian literature. But there is another reason the Book of Parables became so controversial. Unlike several other major sections of First Enoch, it has not been identified among the Aramaic Enoch fragments from Qumran. This absence is real, and it has never received a universally accepted explanation. Why? If the Qumran community preserved numerous copies of Enochic material, why is there no surviving Qumran copy of the Book of Parables? One possibility is that the section was composed later. Another is that it originated in a Jewish community outside the Qumran movement. Another possibility is that manuscripts once existed but simply have not survived. The evidence does not allow us to select one explanation with complete certainty, and this is where the story becomes especially interesting. The Milik theory. One of the most influential arguments came from Polish scholar Joseph Milik. Milik worked extensively with the Aramaic Enoch fragments and published his critical edition of the Qumran material in 1976. He argued that the absence of the Book of Parables from Qumran could indicate that the section was composed later than the other Enochic material. In his interpretation, the parables could have been written after the Qumran community had ceased producing or collecting the manuscripts found in the caves. Milik's position went further. He questioned whether the parables could have been a Christian-era composition. This was a significant claim because it would radically change how the relationship between Enoch and early Christian literature should be understood. If the parables were composed after the emergence of Christianity, then similarities between its Son of Man material and later Christian texts could potentially be explained as influence moving in the opposite direction. But Milik's position did not become the dominant view. Other major scholars challenged it. The mainstream dating debate. Scholars including George Nickelsburg, James VanderKam, and Gabriele Boccaccini have argued for a much earlier Jewish context for the Book of Parables. The dominant scholarly position today generally places its composition somewhere around the late 1st century BCE or early 1st century CE, although the precise date remains debated. That would place the text within the broader intellectual and religious environment of the Second Temple period. Under this dating, the Book of Parables would not simply be a later Christian creation. Instead, it would represent another Jewish apocalyptic tradition that existed within the complex religious environment of the period. But there is an important limitation. Dating the parables earlier does not automatically prove that later Christian writers directly copied them. Influence is possible, shared traditions are possible, independent development is also possible. The exact relationship remains a subject of continuing academic discussion. The Son of Man. Question. The most famous part of this debate concerns the expression Son of Man. In the Book of Parables, the term describes a powerful heavenly figure associated with judgment and the end of the age. In the Gospels, the expression Son of Man also appears repeatedly. Because of this similarity, scholars have spent decades investigating whether there is a historical relationship between the traditions. Some researchers have argued that Enochic literature provides important background for understanding how the expression functioned in the Jewish world of the period. Others emphasize that the phrase has a much broader history and cannot automatically be traced to First Enoch. There are also questions about the dating of the parables themselves. If the parables were written before or around the beginning of the 1st century CE, then the similarities become historically significant. But if the section were substantially later, the direction of influence would become much more complicated. At present, the evidence does not allow the question to be closed completely. That uncertainty is important. The similarity is worth investigating, but similarity alone is not proof of direct literary dependence. The Watchers and 2 Peter. There is another interesting textual connection. The second epistle of Peter contains a passage describing angels who sinned and were confined in a place of darkness while awaiting judgment. First Enoch contains an extensive account of the Watchers, heavenly beings who descend to earth, become involved with humanity, and are eventually imprisoned while awaiting judgment. The similarities are striking. The imagery of fallen heavenly beings, imprisonment, darkness, and future judgment appears in both traditions. 2 Peter also uses the unusual Greek term Tartarus when describing the imprisonment of the angels. That word has a background in Greek mythology and refers to a deep region associated with confinement in the underworld. This does not prove that the author of 2 Peter directly copied First Enoch. The traditions could have circulated independently. The author could also have drawn from a broader body of Jewish traditions concerning fallen angels, but the overlap is significant enough that scholars have discussed it extensively. Again, the responsible approach is to distinguish what is observable from what remains interpretive. The textual parallels are real. The exact mechanism of transmission remains debated. What does this tell us about the ancient world? When these pieces are placed together, a broader picture begins to emerge. Second Temple Judaism was not intellectually uniform. Different communities preserved different texts. Different authors interpreted ancient traditions in different ways. Some writings that later became extremely influential were not yet separated into the categories of canonical and non-canonical that became familiar in later centuries. First Enoch existed within this environment. The Qumran manuscripts demonstrate that Enochic traditions were copied repeatedly. The Epistle of Jude demonstrates that at least one early Christian writer was familiar with an Enochic prophecy and incorporated it into his letter. Other writings contain concepts and imagery that have been compared with Enochic traditions, but none of this automatically tells us how every ancient community viewed the text. The historical record is more complicated than that. Canon was not created overnight. One of the biggest misconceptions about ancient biblical literature is that there was a single moment when every community suddenly received an official list of books. The historical process was considerably more gradual. Different communities used different collections. Different authors gave different levels of authority to different writings. Some texts were widely read without becoming canonical. Others eventually became central to particular traditions. First Enoch is a particularly useful example because its history crosses several different literary and religious environments. It was copied in ancient Jewish communities. It was known to early Christian writers. It survived continuously in Ethiopia. And it eventually became largely unfamiliar to Western readers until the recovery of Ethiopian manuscripts and the later discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That history is far more complicated than simply saying that the book was banned or hidden. The Council of Laodicea. The 4th century is often brought into discussions about the exclusion of Enoch. The Council of Laodicea, traditionally dated to around 364 CE, produced a collection of ecclesiastical canons. Canon 59 addressed the reading of non-canonical books in church settings. A subsequent canonical list traditionally associated with the council does not include First Enoch. However, it is important to be precise. The surviving evidence does not establish that the council specifically targeted Enoch because of one particular passage. Nor does it demonstrate that a coordinated campaign was launched to erase the text. The historical process appears to have involved multiple factors, including questions of authorship, tradition, liturgical use, and perceived authority. Later writers, such as Jerome and Augustine, also expressed reservations about Enoch. Over time, the work became increasingly marginal within many Western Christian traditions, but it continued to survive elsewhere. What about Ethiopia? This is where the manuscript story becomes particularly important. While First Enoch gradually disappeared from common use across much of Europe, it remained part of the Ethiopian literary tradition. Ethiopian manuscripts preserved the text in Ge'ez. Scribes continued copying the work. Generations passed. Languages changed. Libraries changed. Political systems changed. Yet the manuscript tradition continued. By the time James Bruce brought his manuscripts to Europe in 1773, First Enoch had effectively survived through a literary tradition that Western scholars had largely lost access to. That is one of the reasons Ethiopian manuscripts are so important to modern Enoch scholarship. They did not create the ancient text. They preserved a version of a much older tradition, and the Dead Sea Scrolls later confirmed just how ancient parts of that tradition actually were. What is actually established? At this point, it is useful to separate the evidence from the interpretation. What can be established? First, Jude 14:15 contains a passage closely corresponding to First Enoch 1:9 and explicitly identifies Enoch as the source of the prophecy. Second, ancient Enochic manuscripts were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. Third, multiple copies of Enochic literature demonstrate that these traditions circulated extensively during the Second Temple period. Fourth, the Book of Parables has not been identified among the known Qumran Enoch fragments. Fifth, the complete surviving form of First Enoch is preserved through the Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscript tradition. Sixth, ancient writers including Tertullian, Origen, Jerome, and Augustine discussed Enoch and its authority in different ways. And seventh, modern scholars continue to debate the dating and origins of the Book of Parables and its relationship to later literature. These are the areas where the historical record gives us substantial evidence. What remains uncertain? Several important questions remain open. Why exactly is the Book of Parables absent from the Qumran collection? Was it composed before the beginning of the 1st century CE? Was it produced slightly later? Did its author belong to a Jewish community outside the Qumran movement? Did later writers know the text directly? Or were both Enochic and early Christian writings drawing from older traditions circulating throughout the ancient Jewish world? These questions cannot be answered simply by pointing to similarities. They require manuscript evidence, linguistic analysis, historical dating, and careful comparison of textual traditions. That is precisely why the subject remains interesting to researchers. The uncertainty is not a weakness in the investigation. It is part of the investigation. What the Enoch story really reveals. The most interesting conclusion may not be that Enoch was hidden. The evidence does not require that explanation. Instead, the manuscript record reveals something more complicated. Ancient texts could survive in some communities while disappearing from others. A work could be widely read without becoming part of every later canon. A text could influence religious vocabulary without its later readers agreeing about its authority. And a manuscript could disappear for centuries from one part of the world while continuing to be copied somewhere else. First Enoch demonstrates all of these possibilities. Its history connects Second Temple Jewish literature, the Dead Sea Scrolls, early Christian writings, Ethiopian manuscript culture, and modern academic scholarship. That is already remarkable, without adding an unverified conspiracy to the story. The biggest question. So, what should we make of the fact that Jude quotes Enoch? The safest historical conclusion is straightforward. The author of Jude knew an Enochic tradition and considered it useful enough to incorporate into his letter. That tells us something important about the literary environment in which the text was produced. It demonstrates that Enochic traditions were not completely unknown or irrelevant to the communities surrounding early Christianity. But it does not, by itself, answer every question about the authority of First Enoch. Nor does it prove that every passage in First Enoch was regarded in the same way. The ancient world was not operating with the same standardized categories of scripture, commentary, literature, and tradition that modern readers often assume. The real mystery, perhaps the most interesting part of the story, is not what was supposedly removed, it is what survived. An ancient collection of writings was copied repeatedly during the Second Temple period. Fragments survived in the Judean desert. References survived in early Christian literature. The complete work survived in Ethiopian manuscripts. Centuries later, European scholars recovered those manuscripts. Then 20th century archaeology uncovered ancient Aramaic fragments that demonstrated the antiquity of the tradition. And modern scholarship is still trying to reconstruct exactly how all these pieces fit together. That is the real mystery. Not necessarily a hidden conspiracy, not necessarily a forbidden truth, but a fragmented historical record that allows us to see how ancient ideas moved between communities, languages, manuscripts, and generations. Final conclusion. So, was the Book of Enoch known to the world of early Christianity? The evidence strongly suggests that Enochic traditions were part of the intellectual environment surrounding the period. Was Enoch directly quoted in the New Testament? Yes. The Epistle of Jude contains a passage closely corresponding to First Enoch 1:9 and explicitly attributes the prophecy to Enoch. Was First Enoch preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Yes. Multiple Enochic manuscripts were discovered among the Qumran fragments. Was every section of First Enoch found there? No. The Book of Parables remains absent from the known Qumran Enoch manuscripts. Does that prove that the parables were written after the rise of Christianity? No. That was one historical proposal most strongly associated with Joseph Milik, but it has not become the dominant position. Does modern scholarship know exactly when the parables were composed? Not with complete certainty. The dating remains debated, although many scholars place the work somewhere within the late Second Temple period. And does the existence of these connections prove that First Enoch should be classified in a particular theological way today? That is a question beyond what the manuscript evidence alone can establish. What the evidence does show is something more concrete. First Enoch was an ancient and influential body of literature. It circulated widely before the formation of the later biblical canons. Its traditions were known to communities associated with early Christianity. Parts of it were preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Its complete surviving form was preserved in Ethiopia. And more than a century of modern scholarship has still not resolved every question surrounding its origins and transmission. That is enough to make the text worth studying, not because every mystery surrounding it has been solved, but precisely because so many pieces of the historical puzzle remain. The next time someone tells you that the Book of Enoch was simply banned, hidden, or erased, the more useful question is this: what does the manuscript record actually show? Because once the surviving evidence is separated from modern speculation, the story becomes more complicated and, in many ways, far more fascinating. An ancient text survived. Fragments of it were found in the desert. A later writer quoted one of its passages. Different communities debated its authority. One manuscript tradition preserved the complete work. And centuries later, scholars are still reconstructing its history. That is not a story that needs exaggeration. The evidence itself is already remarkable. This documentary examines ancient manuscripts, textual history, and scholarly debates for educational and research purposes. References to Enochic literature, early Christian writings, manuscript traditions, and scholarly interpretations are presented as subjects of historical investigation. Where scholars disagree, those disagreements remain open rather than being presented as settled fact. This documentary does not endorse any particular religious interpretation or attempt to establish theological conclusions from the historical.